How Politicians Use Language to Rewire Your Brain. Wittgenstein. The words that hijack your mind. Ever notice how, after hearing a political debate, you start using their exact words to think about the issue? You walk away from watching the news and suddenly you're thinking about job creators instead of rich people, or undocumented workers instead of illegal immigrants. The politician's language becomes your language. Their framing becomes your framing. Most people think this is just coincidence. They assume language is neutral, that words are just tools we use to describe what's already there. They're wrong. There was this Austrian philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein who figured out something terrifying about how language actually works. He discovered that language doesn't just describe reality, it creates reality. The words you use don't just reflect how you think, they determine how you think. And here's what you don't realize. Politicians know this secret. They've weaponized it. They understand that whoever controls the language controls how you see the world. They're not just trying to win arguments. They're rewiring your brain. The brutal truth? Every time you adopt their phrases, you're letting them into your head. You think you're just using convenient words, but you're actually downloading their entire worldview. Welcome to Keys to the Psyche, where you learn more about yourself and others. Today, I'm going to expose exactly how this linguistic manipulation works, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. You've already been hacked. Think back to the last political conversation you had. You probably used their words without even realizing it. You said tax relief instead of tax cuts, or job creators instead of wealthy business owners. Maybe you found yourself talking about illegal aliens or undocumented immigrants, adopting one side's exact terminology. Here's what happened. You absorbed their language, and with it their entire way of seeing the issue. When you say tax relief, you're not just describing policy, you're accepting the premise that taxes are a burden we need relief from. The word relief implies suffering. It frames taxes as inherently painful, something that hurts you. But what if politicians had trained you to say tax investment instead? Same policy, completely different feeling. Now taxes become something productive, something that builds rather than burdens. You think you chose those words because they're accurate or convenient. Wrong. You chose them because someone planted them in your head through repetition, context, and emotional association. Remember when climate change replaced global warming? That wasn't evolution, that was strategy. Focus groups showed climate change sounded less threatening, more natural. The words shifted, and suddenly the entire conversation felt different. You've experienced this linguistic takeover dozens of times. You just never noticed it happening. The politicians' phrases became your thoughts. Their framing became your reality. And here's the part that should concern you. Once you start thinking in their words, you start seeing the world through their eyes. The language doesn't just describe your position, it shapes what positions seem possible. The real danger. Someone else is programming your reality. This isn't just about clever marketing or political spin. This is about control of your mind. When politicians control language, they control how you think. Not just what you think, how you think. The categories you use, the connections you make, the possibilities you can even imagine. Democracy depends on citizens making informed choices. But if your thoughts are shaped by someone else's language games, are you really choosing? Or are you just picking from options they've pre-selected for you? Think about this. Every time you adopt their phrase, you're downloading their worldview. Death tax doesn't just sound scarier than estate tax. It programs you to see inheritance taxes as literally killing something. The frame becomes your reality. Your brain doesn't distinguish between thoughts you generated and thoughts you absorbed through language. Once you start thinking job creators instead of employers, you've accepted an entire economic philosophy without realizing it. The stakes here are massive. Personal autonomy depends on independent thought. But independent thought requires independent language. When you think in their words, you're thinking their thoughts. Here's what's actually happening. Politicians are running sophisticated psychological operations on your consciousness. They're not just trying to win your vote, they're trying to rewire how you process information about power, money, and society. And here's the brutal truth. It's working. You probably can't even remember the last time you had a political thought that wasn't structured by someone else's language game. The question isn't whether this influence exists. The question is, do you want to understand the mechanism so you can spot it happening? The philosopher who decoded political mind control. Ludwig Wittgenstein wasn't your typical philosopher. While others debated abstract ideas, he obsessed over something much more practical: how language actually works in the real world. Born into one of Austria's wealthiest families in 1889, Wittgenstein could have lived a comfortable life of privilege. Instead, he gave away his inheritance and spent decades wrestling with a question that would change everything. Do words describe reality, or do they create it? His breakthrough came through what he called language games. Picture language not as a mirror reflecting the world, but as a toolkit. Each word is an instrument designed for specific jobs. The word chair doesn't get its meaning by pointing to some perfect chair in heaven. It gets meaning from how we use it in real situations. When you say, grab a chair, you're playing a different language game than when you say, the electric chair. Same word, completely different rules. The meaning lives in the game, not in the word itself. Here's where it gets dangerous. Wittgenstein realized that whoever controls the language games controls how you think about reality. Change the rules of the game, and you change what's possible to think. Politicians figured this out before most philosophers did. They're not just communicating, they're designing the mental software you use to process political information. Every carefully chosen phrase is a new language game, complete with its own rules about what counts as reasonable, moral, or even possible. They've turned political discourse into a battlefield or competing language games, and most people don't even realize they're playing. How do these language games actually work in politics? The techniques are more sophisticated than you think. The 4 weapons politicians use against your mind. The first technique is reframing through strategic word choice. Politicians don't describe events. They redesign how you experience them mentally. Take the phrase tax relief. Relief implies suffering. You don't get relief from something good. By calling tax cuts relief, politicians aren't just advocating for lower taxes. They're programming your brain to experience taxes as pain that needs healing. The Democrats play the same game with investment in infrastructure. Not spending, investment. Investments pay returns. Who argues against profitable investments? The word choice creates the conclusion before you even examine the policy. This isn't accidental. These phrases are tested in focus groups until they find language that bypasses rational analysis and triggers emotional responses. The second weapon is creating entirely new language games. Politicians don't just use existing words differently. they invent whole new categories of meaning. Consider collateral damage. The military didn't have this phrase before modern warfare. They created it because accidentally killing civilians sounds horrific. Collateral damage sounds technical, unavoidable, almost mathematical. Same reality, completely different mental processing. Enhanced interrogation instead of torture. Ethnic cleansing instead of genocide. Downsizing instead of mass firings. Each phrase establishes new rules for how you're allowed to think about the situation. You can't think clearly about torture if the only words available are enhanced interrogation techniques. The language game defines what thoughts are possible. The third technique is shifting the rules mid-conversation. Watch how politicians change which language game they're playing when they start losing. A politician caught in corruption suddenly starts talking about political witch hunts. They've jumped from the language game of law and evidence to the language game of persecution and victimhood. Different rules, different standards of proof, different emotional associations. Another example? Climate change became climate crisis when change felt too neutral. Then climate emergency when crisis lost impact. Each shift changes what responses seem reasonable. Emergencies require immediate action without debate. The fourth and most dangerous technique is using words as tools, not descriptions. Wittgenstein's key insight applies perfectly here. Politicians don't use language to communicate truth. They use it to build specific mental structures in your head. When a politician says, "The American people want," they're not reporting survey data. They're claiming authority to speak for you. The phrase does work. It creates legitimacy and consensus that didn't exist before they spoke. Studies show functions the same way. Most people never check the studies. The phrase isn't there to inform, it's there to trigger your deference to scientific authority and end critical thinking. These aren't communication techniques. They're cognitive engineering tools designed to reshape how your brain processes political information. The brutal truth. Both sides are playing the same game. Let me show you exactly how this works in practice, because once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Take the phrase, secure the border. Republicans didn't choose those words randomly. Secure triggers safety concerns. The border makes it sound like there's one clear line being crossed. They could have said immigration reform or border management, but those don't create the same mental image of threat and protection. Democrats responded by changing the language game entirely. They started saying comprehensive immigration reform. Notice what happened? The focus shifted from security to process, from immediate threat to long-term policy. Same issue, completely different mental framework. Here's where it gets interesting. Both sides used Wittgenstein's insight that words create reality, not just describe it. When Republicans say illegal immigrants, they're embedding criminality into the identity. When Democrats say undocumented workers, they're emphasizing labor and paperwork issues instead of law breaking. Neither side is describing the same people differently. They're creating different categories of people in your mind. The climate debate shows this even more clearly. Global warming became climate change when warming sounded too gradual. Then climate crisis when change felt manageable. Now we're at climate emergency, which automatically justifies emergency measures without debate. Conservative voices did the same thing in reverse. Climate change became climate variability, making it sound natural and cyclical rather than human-caused. Both sides understand that controlling the language means controlling how you think about the issue. They're not trying to communicate truth. They're trying to install specific thought patterns in your head. You're not watching a debate about facts. You're watching a competition over which language game becomes dominant in your mind. You can never watch politics the same way again. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. Every political speech, every news interview, every campaign slogan, you'll notice the language games being played in real time. That phrase that seems so reasonable, you'll catch the reframe. That word choice that felt neutral, you'll spot the embedded assumption. The politician who sounds like they're just stating facts, you'll see them installing thought patterns. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't necessarily evil. Language always shapes thought. When you say, "I'm having a rough day," you're not describing reality. You're creating a mental framework where struggles become temporary weather patterns. When someone calls a mistake a learning opportunity, they're rewiring how you think about failure. Politicians didn't invent this. They just got really good at it. The brutal truth? You've been participating in language games your entire life. Every conversation, every book, every movie, all of them shape how you see the world. The only difference is most people do it unconsciously. Politicians do it on purpose. The power isn't in avoiding language games, that's impossible. The power is in choosing which ones you participate in. When someone says illegal immigrants, you can recognize the game and decide whether to play. When they switch to climate emergency, you can see the reframe happening and choose your response. You're not a victim of political language, you're a participant who can now see the rules. Your new political superpower. So here's your assignment. For the next week, every time you watch political news or read campaign content, ask yourself one simple question. What language game is being played here? Don't just absorb the message, examine the machinery. When a politician says, hard-working families, catch the assumed division between deserving and undeserving people. When they shift from tax relief to revenue enhancement, notice the reframe in real time. You'll start seeing patterns everywhere. The candidate who keeps saying common sense solutions, they're not describing their policies, they're positioning opponents as unreasonable. The pundit who calls something a crisis versus a challenge, they're installing different emotional responses in your brain. Once you start playing this game consciously, politics becomes less about choosing teams and more about understanding the moves. You become harder to manipulate because you see the manipulation happening. And here's what I guarantee will happen. Within a month, you'll catch yourself thinking differently about political issues. Not because someone convinced you of their position, but because you started choosing which language games deserved your participation. That's the real power Wittgenstein revealed. Language shapes thought. But once you know the rules, you get to decide which thoughts you want shaped. If you want more content on the hidden psychological mechanisms that run your world, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because trust me, this is just the beginning of what you don't realize is happening inside your own mind.